Listen for and hear the word of the Lord from the 28th chapter of the book of Genesis. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And Jacob dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside Jacob and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you. Know that I will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done that which I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar. He poured oil on the top of it, and he called that place Bethel. This is the word of the Lord. And Jacob is a man on the run. He'd been a trickster, a prankster since the day he and his twin brother were born, but this time Jacob has finally gone too far. You see, a father's blessing was a big deal in the ancient world. It was significant and irrevocable. By impersonating his barely older brother Esau, Jacob fooled his elderly father Isaac into giving him the blessing intended solely for the firstborn son. And now Jacob is in serious mortal danger. His brother Esau is looking for him with plans to kill him. So with help from his doting mother Rebekah, Jacob flees his home hoping to survive. And 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, you thought your family system was complicated. Well, that's where we find Jacob this morning. He's on the run in the middle of the desert, not only running from his brother, but from his God as well. At least that's what Jacob thought. Well, finally, a safe distance away, surely exhausted from the hasty retreat, watching the sun set on the horizon, Jacob finds a stone pillow. Why did he think that was a good idea? And closes his eyes for a bit of rest. And that's when the unexpected happens. The God from whom Jacob has been running shows up. Even more surprisingly, that God from whom Jacob has been running makes unconditional promises to this broken, fearful, sinful young man. Remember, God says, I am with you. I will not leave you until what I have promised is done. With God's voice still ringing in his young head, Jacob wakes up. Now nothing around him has changed. He lies in the same dusty wilderness, same stone pillow propped under his head, same dire, deadly circumstances, and yet for this young man, Jacob, everything has changed in those hours of dreaming. We know this because of what he says, and we know this because of what he does. First, he speaks out loud, as if someone could hear him in that deserted place. Surely the Lord is here, and I didn't know it. Jacob might have said, surely God is here, and I didn't want it. Then he turns that pillow into pillar, rooted in earth, pointing toward heaven like that ladder on which the angels ascended and descended. And he gives that place in the middle of nowhere a name, Bethel. Now, in her book, An Altar in the World, Barbara Brown Taylor writes, "The first time I read Jacob's story in the Bible, I knew it was true whether it ever happened or not." I think she's right about that. If Jacob's story is true in the deepest sense, true beyond fact, then it could have an impact on how and where we perceive the presence of the divine to whom we belong. It would influence where we build altars and bow down to worship. The story begs the question, where does God live? Now, I hope that the church, and this church, is or is becoming a place of belonging for you, a place where you expect to encounter the sacred when you enter the doors. It certainly has become that for me. In my life, I have been fortunate enough to experience God's presence in many wonderful churches. The church community was the place where I first felt welcomed and knew I was loved. From clapboard country chapels to soaring Gothic cathedrals, sanctuaries have always been places of comfort and inspiration for me, and I'm grateful for that. I want the same to be true for every child born and raised in this congregation and for every person who enters our doors, every stranger, guest, friend, and neighbor. I want them to know that in this space we do things we do nowhere else in our lives, that we share our deepest selves in moving and profound ways. I want all who enter this space to know that in worship we experience God in a unique way. And yet this story of a dream in the wilderness reminds me that the presence of God must never be limited to the places we construct or the times we set aside to acknowledge God's presence. Jacob named that place Bethel, house of God, not because he built a sanctuary there, but because that's where God found him. It was the house of God because that's where God chose to live for Jacob when he most needed to experience God's presence. Have you ever found God in an unexpected place, an unusual place, even an unwanted place? In my ministry, I've found that sometimes those places are physical. We discover the unexpected presence of God in a hospital waiting room or on a long trip. We find the presence of God in a coffee shop or a neighbor's home. But often those places are more spiritual and deeply personal. Perhaps despite your expectations, you have found the presence of God in a place of grief, brokenness, deep sadness. Maybe you experience God with your tears shed at injustice, tears shed out of anger. We discover God's presence when we are aware of our own brokenness or our own weakness. Surely God was in this place and I didn't even know it. The wonder of worship is that it happens anywhere God shows up, and that is truly anywhere. so long as we center ourselves long enough to know the presence of God deep in our hearts. Some of you know that I am passionate about worship, and that one of my deepest desires is for this space, this time, to be a time and a space where all of God's children can gather together. This leads me to be passionate about the place of our youngest members, our elementary-aged members, and our teenagers in worship. There's a reason for that. It has to do, I think, with my own story and this morning's story from the Bible's first book and the promise sealed in that final book. If you asked me to share my most embarrassing story, now I know you didn't ask, but then you didn't know you could. If you asked me to tell my most embarrassing story, I would tell a church story. And if you were asked to ask me about the moment I first knew I belonged to God, I would probably tell the very same story. I was 4 years old, and it was Sunday morning. My older sister and I were sitting with my mother in worship at Unity Presbyterian Church in rural Rowan County, North Carolina, a country church. The membership were farmers from the local community. This will surprise no one, but 4-year-old Chris lived for the children's sermon. It was my weekly chance to show off what I knew and get a chuckle from the congregation as well. The service began as my father, the pastor, led us in an opening prayer. We stood to sing that opening hymn, and soon I turned to my mother in the pew and whispered, "I need to use the bathroom." She scooted back to let me out of the pew, but I froze when I realized that if I left now, there was a good chance I would miss the children's sermon. Well, soon the situation was too serious. When you've got to go, you've got to go. So I sprinted down the aisle, across the hall to the boys' room, did what needed done, and sprinted back just as the children's sermon was beginning. I made it! As I came rushing down the aisle, my father looked at me with wide eyes. "Chris," he said, "can you please pull up your pants?" Oh, I got my chuckle that day from the congregation. But I also received the kindness and love of a whole community of folks who wrapped their arms around me, who laughed not at me but with me, who welcomed me. In that moment, I knew I belonged. Even now, I wonder how much of my love for the church was birthed in that moment, or the many others like it before and after. Look, all of us who care about the future are rightly invested in the young people we know and love. For most of us, that involves teaching them to be good citizens, to be compassionate people who care about the needs of others, who invest in the lives of their neighbors. We teach our children the ethical and righteous way to live. We begin with basic lessons about sharing and waiting their turn, and God knows we need to shape children to be good people and give them the tools to lead us. But here is my concern. Without an experience of transcendence, I worry that all that training and all that instruction is finally not sustainable. I worry that the emphasis, even in the church, on making good people has been unnecessarily and tragically divorced from the task of making disciples of Jesus Christ. In my own experience, it takes more than knowing the right thing to do, being armed with the right answers to questions. It takes an experience of holiness. What is transformative for Jacob in this morning's story is not some sudden memory of lessons learned or instructions received. It is this unexpected unexpected encounter with God. In recent years, I've become convinced and convicted by the work of Kara Powell at Fuller Seminary in California, who coined the term sticky faith. Sticky faith is the faith that stays with our children through the teen years and into adulthood. And do you know what it takes to form sticky faith? Not the right information, not confessions and creeds memorized and recited, but the right experience. Worshiping with your family. Watching as adults you love and trust pray and give and practice their faith. Hearing about faith at home, experiencing the sacred as a part of the rhythm of your life. Sticky faith is not taught so much as it is caught. Now, I suspect there are many reasons why we worship as there are people gathered here this morning. And I can imagine that our reasons sometimes change from one week to the next. I know mine do. For some of us, worship is a habit. It's just what we do on Sunday mornings. Maybe we've been doing it for a very long time, and it's become as natural and familiar as getting out of bed in the morning. Worship is a habit. For others, worship is obligation. We are here because we feel a duty, either self-imposed or imposed upon us by someone else, to be here. Now, every once in a while, I'll hear criticism of those who worship out of duty or habit, as if somehow that negates its impact. I think this is deeply unfair. Habits, obligations, duties, responsibilities, these are the very actions that form us over time, and that's what worship does too. Worship forms us over time. Yes, we become a reflection of that which we worship. Not long ago, one of you sent me a column about the importance of worship in an age of decline, when many pastors rightly lament that regular attendance now means once a month instead of every week. The author, who is a pastor in Massachusetts, writes, "When people sometimes tell me they don't get anything from worship, I'm happy to answer, that's great, because it's not about you." He writes, "Our culture needs at least one place in our lives that tells us everything is not always about us, about our personal happiness, our convenience, our frantic timetables, our shrinking commitments." And he's right about that. Worship is not primarily about us. Despite the initial appeal of extravagant productions and me-first messages, the purpose of this time, space set apart is to focus our hearts and our minds not on ourselves, but on God. Recently, I was out to lunch with one of you, one who attends worship here almost every Sunday. And since the topic has been on my mind, I asked him why he shows up week after week. He thought for a moment, and then he said, I was going to say something about how I was raised in the church, so that's just what I'm used to, but that's not really it. I think I go to worship because it is my weekly reminder of what is really important. He went on to describe how hectic and disjointed he can become during the week. He was honest about the many tugs that there are on his time and energy, and particularly vulnerable about how aspects of his profession tempt him to move away from what he knows is right, ethical, and sound judgment. He said, "For me, worship provides a centered place of focus without distraction. It resets my moral compass and sets me on the right path again." So what about you? You who are heavily burdened, weary from the walk, give some of that away this morning. You who are spiritually malnourished and need sustenance for the journey ahead, take in what matters through the gift of God-centered liturgy. You for whom God has seemed too distant for too long, whose worship has grown empty and whose life has seemed directionless. Do not go in search of God this morning. Stay right where you are. In those places of uncertainty, doubt, and fear, stay right there and let God come to you. Because in this place, in this time, in this community, God is not distant. Whether you expected it or not, the Lord is in this place. In every place where we center our souls in worship and seek meaning, where we find our hearts encouraged and our souls lifted up. That ancient vision, it showed Jacob something he never could have discovered on his own, something he didn't even know he needed to find. God came to him right where he was. He slept in Bethel. He lived in God's house. And so do you. Amen.